Wait, so they had a meeting to decide if they should retreat. Okay, well, what did they decide? To do it, right. And did they do it? No. The meeting went on too long, so it was too late. Brilliant, yeah. November 5th, 1950. U.S. Army units continued to march towards the trap set for them by the Chinese, still arguing over whether the Chinese are even really there. Well, they can wonder no longer because this week, the trap is sprung. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, we saw American and British forces make progress along both coasts, with Ned Almond's 10th Corps landing at Wonsan and Iwan, and the British 27th Commonwealth Brigade leading the charge north in the west. But the big news was the savaging of South Korean 2nd Corps in the center, around Onjong and Kojang, by the Chinese. And the week ended with the South Korean 7th Regiment, the first UN unit to reach the Yalu River border with China, starting to buckle under the Chinese onslaught. And as this week gets going, buckle it does, and then it breaks. As we saw last week, air support was able to keep the regiment alive throughout the daylight hours the 29th, but as night fell, the Chinese forces attacked with greater intensity. They swarmed all over the ROK positions. ROK is the South Koreans. Under cover of night, fighting at close quarters. Individual pockets of ROK troops at this time didn't really know what was going on. Some held their positions and fought until killed or captured, and others disappeared into the hills in the darkness. The latter option proves to be the sensible one for survival, because as dawn breaks October 30th, as this week begins, the ROK 7th Regiment is gone. Of its 3,552 men, only around 875 escaped. The rest are killed or captured. Their regimental commander, Lim Bu Taik, and two of his battalion commanders are part of those escapees, but the rest of his staff and all of the regiment's KMAG advisors are lost. KMAG are American military advisors. But you know what? 7th Regiment was actually only engaged by a single battalion of the PVA's 373rd Regiment 125th Division. The PVA are the Communist Chinese forces. Now, this really is a disaster for the ROK 6th Division, which 7th Regiment is part of, who has now lost its last remaining combat-capable regiment and lost it to a far smaller force. But this really is the exact kind of combat the Communist Chinese forces excel at. Remember, loads of these men are veterans of the Chinese Civil War, and they have plenty of experience fighting numerically larger and better equipped foes. They attack quickly and fiercely. They fight in close quarters. They use the cover of night to their advantage. They use morale as a weapon. It is not a style for the faint of heart, but very, very effective when done right. And unfortunately for ROK 2nd Corps, which has now been thoroughly beaten in this sector, this kind of rugged, hilly, and forested terrain with few roads and settlements is ideal for these kinds of tactics. If the PVA could pick any battlefield for their first clashes with UN forces, this really would be it. Down near Unsan, the Americans are about to get their first taste of how the Chinese do things. U.S. 1st Cavalry Division's week gets going in odd fashion. Elements of the division begin arriving to relieve and assist men of the ROK 1st Division, which has been skirmishing with Chinese forces north of Unsan since October 25th. 1st Cavalry Division's 8th Regiment takes over the sector, while the ROK troops concentrate east of them across the river. But what the Americans find when they arrive is not a bloody pitched battle, as some expect to find, but mountains of smoke rising from the forests to their north. The smoke makes any recon difficult, and, as soon becomes apparent, that is the point. The morning of November 1st, reports start coming in. Large numbers of hostile troops moving to their west, heading southwards and bypassing Unsan entirely. This news makes 1st Cavalry Division Commander Hobart Gay very anxious. He knows the regiments of his division are a bit strung out. The 8th Regiment holds Unsan, the 5th guards their rear, but are some distance down the road, and the 7th is still near the Chongchon River. He phones 1st Corps and asks to withdraw 8th Regiment south of Unsan and bring the 7th over to assist. Request denied. If Gay's request had been acted upon immediately, something might have been done to prevent what happens. Maybe. By noon the 1st, it is too late. The jaws begin to snap shut. Elements of 5th Regiment on patrol find a strong blocking force of PVA troops holding the road south of Unsan, cutting off the 8th Regiment from the rest of the division. 8th now faces strong Chinese forces to their north, west, and south, and a military disaster to add to the ranks of Task Force Smith, Taejon, and Bloody Gulch is brewing. The ROK troops holding the ground to their east are all that stand between them and total encirclement. And all that evening, the ROK come under heavy attacks. Chinese troops begin to really hit the ROK about 5 that afternoon, advancing with the support of Soviet Katyusha rockets. By 9 p.m., the ROK are falling back, and by 11 are starting to crumble, opening up the east flank of the Americans in Unsan. With much sounding of bugles and whistles, the Chinese extended their strong attacks westward to the 2nd Battalion, and in a short time penetrated its right and encircled its left. At the same time, the fight with the 1st Battalion went on. Near the battalion boundary, A Company reported it was engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the enemy in 2 directions, had pulled back its left flank, and was withdrawing to the next ridge. On Milliken's right, the tanks holding the ground along the river were being pressed back. By 11 p.m., both the 1st and 2nd Battalions had been forced back and their positions penetrated. The 1st Battalion had expended its basic load of ammunition and most of the reserve ammunition the regiment had sent forward. Milliken reported by radio to the regimental commander the increasingly desperate situation of the 2 frontline battalions and the fact that he was almost out of ammunition. At this time, there's a crisis meeting underway at U.S. 1st Corps headquarters, because by now there's information flooding in about what happened to ROK 2nd Corps at Onjong last week and reports from the ground at Unsan. It's decided that 1st Corps will shift from offense to defense, effective immediately. This is the first time 1st Corps has played any defense since its breakout from the Pusan perimeter in September. Their forces pushing northwest are recalled, and 2nd Division from 9th Corps, which has been doing anti-guerrilla duties in southwest Korea, but is attached to 1st Corps earlier that day, begins to move north. It is too late for the decisions of this meeting to have much of an impact on what's going on at Unsan. But the timing of the meeting could not have been worse. It actually delays the withdrawal order for 8th Cavalry by a couple of crucial hours. By midnight, when the order finally comes, the ground across the river to their east, where ROK units had stood just hours earlier, is now held by the Chinese. The only route out of Unsan is to head southeast towards Ipsok, which is held by the rest of ROK 1st Division. A messy retreat goes off in this direction, during which many Americans are captured or killed. The Chinese push on, determined to close the pocket. About 2 a.m., American Captain Jack Balt, commander of C Battery, 99th Field Artillery Battalion, has a particularly narrow escape south of the town. As he waited, Captain Balt happened to glance to his left across the paddy ground, and in the moonlight, he saw a line of men coming towards the road. He thought they were retreating 8th Cavalry infantrymen and remarked about them to his driver. When the oncoming soldiers were about 50 to 75 yards away, the entire group opened fire on the road. Bolt shouted to his driver to get going, and upon rounding a curve where the hill came down to the road, they lost sight of the rest of the battery at the road fork. Just around the curve, from 15 to 20 enemy soldiers stood in the road. They opened fire on the jeep as it raced towards them. Bolt returned it with his submachine gun. The enemy group scattered to the sides of the road. The jeep raced on and passed 2 other small enemy groups, the last one numbering no more than 3 or 4 soldiers. Every road is now blocked, and the soldiers left in Unsan have to take their chances in small groups, abandoning their heavy equipment and trying to infiltrate through the Chinese lines. 3rd Battalion, the rear guard southwest of Unsan, has had a quiet night compared to the rest of the regiment up to this point. They also now face a tricky situation though. By about 3 in the morning, they know their lines of retreat are blocked. So they plan a cross-country retreat to join up with where they think the rest of the regiment will be. This is when a unit of lost ROK troops emerges from the night to their south and joins up with them. As the ROK troops arrive at the battalion command post, a bugle is blown, and seconds later, US troops are being mowed down left and right. These are not ROK men, but a unit of Chinese commandos. They quickly disable or destroy the battalion's tanks with satchel charges and set the rest of the vehicles ablaze. Before the Americans even know what's happening, a wider assault starts on the battalion from all directions. With Chinese troops charging their positions in front of them and commandos wreaking havoc behind them, the scene descends into bloody close-quarters fighting, which lasts for several days. Less than 200 men of 3rd Battalion make it out, and more than 1,000 men of the regiment are missing in action. The first big battle between US and Chinese forces is over, and the Americans have been soundly beaten. Surely, UN Commander Douglas MacArthur's intelligence chief Charles Willoughby cannot deny the presence of the Chinese in Korea now, and he doesn't. Well, not entirely anyway. As the news of ROK's 2nd Corps' ravaging last week comes in, and the disaster at Unsan unfolds, Willoughby is forced to accept what is obvious to everyone on the ground, that the Chinese have intervened in the war. Hey, remember I said last week that Ned Allman planned to travel to Hamhung now on the 30th to interrogate Chinese prisoners taken by 10th Corps? Well, he does do that, and interrogates quite a lot of them, and shortly afterward, Willoughby visits Allman's headquarters in Wonsan, and an argument breaks out between them. Willoughby insisted that no full divisions of Chinese were in Korea, but only elements of such divisions. On one occasion, General Willoughby, with General Doyle Hickey, acting FECOM Chief of Staff, visited Allman's 10th Corps headquarters in Wonsan. After hearing reports of POW interrogations, Hickey turned to Willoughby. If, as General Allman says, these people turn out to be Chinese, Ned Allman roared, "What do you mean, if? They are Chinese!" Willoughby tried to allay their fears. He stated that only a few volunteers were in Korea, and it was most likely that only a battalion of each identified division was actually across the border. To which Ned Allman asked bluntly, "What happened to the 8th Cavalry over in 8th Army?" Willoughby was of the opinion that the regiment had failed to put out adequate security, and had therefore been overrun by a small, violent attack. Okay, that explanation is not entirely without merit. The 8th Cavalry was indeed strung out and vulnerable. But at this point, Willoughby is twisting facts to suit theories, not theories to suit facts. Willoughby gives his estimate of Chinese numbers in Korea on November 3rd. 16,500 at minimum and a maximum of 34,000. In reality, there are nearly 250,000 Chinese troops already in Korea, with more arriving each day. In contrast to Willoughby, the Chinese have learned a lot from their new foes at Unsan. They have proven to themselves that with the right tactics, the American superiority in equipment can be overcome. There are, of course, people in the PVA who doubt their ability to take on the Americans, but there are certainly fewer of them after Unsan. The Chinese there start writing down the lessons learned fighting against the Americans, and they plan to distribute these to the rest of the Chinese armies in Korea in the form of a pamphlet or a handbook. I'll read you some of it when they finished if I manage to get a copy. 8th Army is busy setting up defensive positions. The U.S. 24th Division and the British 27th Commonwealth Brigade were pushing northwest and actually came close to the Yalu River, but they're given the orders to halt and then to fall back, following the disaster at Unsan. 8th Army Commander Walton Walker begins reorganizing his forces on the Chongchon River, officially because of supply concerns. While these are genuine concerns, the reality is Walker simply does not know what dangers his men face north of the river. Tokyo is immediately on his back, but Walker holds firm, and Tokyo agrees to a short delay to build up supplies north of Pyongyang. Walker also instructs that until further notice, all new 8th Army replacements are to go towards rebuilding the 1st Cavalry Division. That division is a key asset to Walker, and no matter whether 8th Army advances or retreats, he needs it back to full strength. In the east, although U.S. 10th Corps' advance continues, the regimental commanders of 1st Marine Division, they take things slowly. The bulk of the Chinese forces are not here, and Ned Allman voices his displeasure, but none of the commanders on the ground are willing to march their men into an Unsan of their own. the Chinese not wanting to leave anyone out. It's actually the turn of the Commonwealth troops to be hit next. The British 27th Commonwealth Brigade made it as far as Taechon, but withdraws to the area around Pakchon and has the job of holding the bridgehead across the Chongchon River. They are attacked heavily by elements of the PVA 40th Army the night of November 4th. But supported by American artillery and air power, they do manage to largely hold off the Chinese assault, with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Regiment, along with the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, engaged in brutal and constant fighting. Thing is, the aim of the Chinese here is not to destroy the enemy, but rather to blow the bridges across the Chongchon. Any chance of that dies today the 5th, as a heroic counterattack by the Australians recaptures much of the ground taken by the Chinese in the initial push, causing heavy casualties. So as the week ends, the PVA begin retreating from the scene. So it's not only doom and gloom for the UN side this week. And in fact, the week ends with some good news for them, as the first elements of US 3rd Division begin disembarking at Wonsan to join Almond's 10th Corps. Maybe they can do something to turn the tables. We know the Chinese presence on that coast is weaker than in the west, for now, so perhaps 10th Corps can take a turn being the hammer while 8th Army becomes the anvil. But that really all depends on the Chinese and what they do next. As for what we do next, not much, for that is it for this week of the war. The mood at 8th Army headquarters is very different now from 2 weeks ago, and while things are not at a crisis point just yet, the UN forces are very much shaken. Walton Walker is now even considering a major withdrawal of 8th Army. The Marines in the East are taking things slowly too, and when guys like 1st Marine Regiment Commander Chesty Puller are worried, you better believe it's worth worrying about. But the politics of the US mission in Korea may be about to shift, because just 2 days from now, on November 7th, the American people will go to the polls for the 1950 midterm elections. The war's popularity with the American people has waxed and waned, and we'll soon see what those people make of the Chinese intervention. But what exactly is the end game here for the Chinese? Do they intend to go toe-to-toe with the US? Do they want to push all the way to Busan and help the North annex the South? Is it all just a bluff to have the UN forces sue for peace? Well, whatever it is, the Chinese do have a plan, and so far, it is working. And you can watch it unfold right here, week by week by week. And it is thanks to the Time Ghost Army, for that is what finances all of our productions. You too can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com and be part of this. These are the newest commissioned officers in the Army, and Paul Chamberlain is the Army Member of the Week. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.